Get on the ground now. Detective Ethan Holloway's voice boomed through the bright afternoon air as he kicked down Agent Natalie Cross's front door, his long-sleeved uniform stretching across his chest. "She's got something in her hand," another officer shouted, weapon drawn as Natalie Cross slowly reached for her red blazer pocket. The midday sun streamed through her mansion's tall windows, illuminating the chaos as 6 officers swarmed her marble foyer, boots echoing off polished floors. Detective Ethan Holloway grabbed her wrist roughly, sneering. "Anonymous tip says you're running drugs out of this place, and frankly, I believe it. People like you don't earn houses like this honestly." Agent Natalie Cross's fingers closed around the leather wallet in her pocket, and she almost smiled. They had no idea they were about to destroy their own careers with a single touch. Welcome to Frost Folktales. This is where we tell the stories of those who were underestimated, dismissed, and targeted, yet chose courage over silence. If these stories move you, subscribe and be part of a community that refuses to let them fade into the background. The sound of splintering wood still echoed through the grand entrance hall as Detective Ethan Holloway shoved Agent Natalie Cross against her own mahogany banister, his weathered face twisted with a mixture of authority and prejudice that she'd seen countless times in her line of work. The afternoon sunlight pouring through her floor-to-ceiling windows cast harsh shadows across his angular features, revealing the deep lines of a man who'd spent years making assumptions about people who looked exactly like her. "Don't move another muscle," Detective Ethan Holloway barked, his grip tightening on her shoulder as he pressed her against the polished wood. His long-sleeved navy uniform bore the stench of stale coffee and cheap cologne, a combination that made Agent Natalie Cross's stomach turn. The badge on his chest caught the natural light streaming through her skylight, reflecting back at her like a twisted mirror of justice gone wrong. Agent Natalie Cross remained perfectly still, her dark slacks pressed against the banister as she felt the cool metal of her FBI credentials through the fabric of her red blazer. Her professional training had prepared her for moments like this, though she'd never imagined it would happen in her own home, surrounded by the Italian marble and custom furniture she'd worked decades to afford. "Raymond, search the living room," Detective Ethan Holloway called out to his partner, never taking his eyes off Agent Natalie Cross. Officer Raymond Tate, a stocky man in a short-sleeved uniform and black pants, immediately began tearing through her carefully curated space. The sound of books hitting the floor and cushions being torn apart filled the air, each crash a violation that made Agent Natalie Cross's jaw tighten with controlled rage. The natural lighting from her open-concept design illuminated every detail of the destruction. Officer Raymond Tate grabbed her crystal bookends, checking behind leather-bound law texts that cost more than his monthly salary. His rough hands left fingerprints on surfaces that had been meticulously maintained by her housekeeper just that morning. The afternoon sun streaming through her panoramic windows created an almost surreal quality to the chaos, as if she were watching a crime drama instead of living through one. From her position against the banister, Agent Natalie Cross could see straight across the street where Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto stood at her window. The elderly Japanese woman wore a light blue jacket over gray slacks, her weathered hands pressed against the glass as she watched the scene unfold. Agent Natalie Cross recognized the expression on her neighbor's face, the mixture of guilt and fear that came with being the catalyst for something far bigger than anticipated. Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto had lived in this upscale neighborhood for 30 years, and in all that time, she'd probably never seen anything like the chaos now consuming Agent Natalie Cross's front yard. Detective Ethan Holloway's fingers dug deeper into her shoulder as he leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear. "So what is it? Cocaine? Heroin?" His voice dripped with the kind of certainty that came from years of making assumptions based on skin color rather than evidence. "The way you dress, this house, that fancy car in your driveway. Nobody earns this kind of money legitimately in your situation." Agent Natalie Cross felt her fingers curl slightly, brushing against the FBI badge in her pocket. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same federal credentials she'd spent 15 years earning were now hidden just inches from a man who believed she was incapable of honest success. Every racist assumption rolling off his tongue was being mentally catalogued, each violation of her civil rights carefully noted for the federal case she'd been building against his entire unit. The fluorescent lights in her kitchen flickered on as 2 more officers moved through her home like locusts. Their boots scraped against her hardwood floors, leaving scuff marks that would serve as permanent reminders of this afternoon. Agent Natalie Cross could hear them opening cabinets, dumping out drawers, treating her personal space like a crime scene before they'd found a single piece of evidence to justify their presence. "You live here alone?" Detective Ethan Holloway's question carried implications that made her skin crawl. His eyes swept over the expensive artwork lining her walls, the custom lighting fixtures, the imported furniture that reflected years of careful saving and investment. Everything about his expression suggested he believed a black woman in $1 million home had to be involved in something illegal. The natural light pouring through her skylights illuminated every detail of his disgust, as if her success was a personal affront to his worldview. "I work for the federal government," Agent Natalie Cross replied calmly, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. She could feel the weight of her credentials in her pocket, the leather wallet containing not just her FBI badge, but also her civil rights investigator identification. For 6 months, she'd been documenting Detective Ethan Holloway's pattern of targeting successful black residents, and now he was gift-wrapping the final piece of evidence she needed. Detective Ethan Holloway laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive as it echoed through her marble foyer. "Federal government, right. Let me guess. You're a secretary somewhere downtown." His grip on her shoulder tightened as he gestured toward her living room, where Officer Raymond Tate was now examining her flat-screen television like it was stolen property. This kind of setup doesn't come from filing paperwork and answering phones. The afternoon sun shifted slightly, casting new shadows across her entrance hall as more officers spread throughout her home. Agent Natalie Cross could hear them in her bedroom, going through her personal belongings with the kind of callous disregard that would make excellent evidence in federal court. Every drawer opened without a warrant, every cabinet searched without probable cause, every assumption made based on her race rather than any actual evidence of wrongdoing. Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto was still watching from across the street, and Agent Natalie Cross wondered what had prompted the anonymous call that brought these officers to her door. Late-night visitors, Detective Ethan Holloway had mentioned, which meant her elderly neighbor had misinterpreted the federal agents who'd been meeting with her to discuss strategy for their investigation. The irony was almost perfect. Mrs. Ipur, Harriet Yamamoto's racial paranoia, had delivered the corrupt officers directly into the hands of the FBI agent who'd been hunting them for months. Detective Ethan Holloway released her shoulder and stepped back, his hand resting on his weapon as he surveyed her home with obvious resentment. The natural lighting streaming through her windows highlighted every detail of his expression, from the deep-set prejudice in his eyes to the way his jaw clenched when he looked at her expensive furnishings. "This whole neighborhood's changing," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Used to be decent people lived here." Agent Natalie Cross felt a cold smile tug at the corner of her mouth. She'd heard similar comments in case files, recorded conversations, and witness testimonies throughout her investigation. Detective Ethan Holloway's unit had a well-documented pattern of harassment in upscale neighborhoods where successful black families had moved in. The anonymous tips, the sudden raids, the aggressive questioning about how they could afford their homes. Everything happening right now was textbook civil rights violation, and he was too blinded by his own prejudice to realize he was destroying his career with every word. The fluorescent lights in her kitchen cast harsh shadows as Officer Raymond Tate called out from the other room. "Ethan, You need to see this." His voice carried the excitement of someone who believed he'd found evidence, though Agent Natalie Cross knew her home contained nothing more incriminating than law enforcement textbooks and case files related to her federal investigation. Detective Ethan Holloway's eyes lit up with anticipation as he looked back at Agent Natalie Cross. Whatever he finds in there is going to put you away for a long time. The way he said it suggested he'd already decided her guilt before examining any evidence. His long-sleeved uniform was beginning to show sweat stains under the bright natural lighting, betraying the excitement he felt at what he assumed would be a major drug bust in an upscale neighborhood. Agent Natalie Cross remained perfectly calm, her fingers still resting against the FBI credentials in her pocket. In 15 years of federal law enforcement, she'd learned to recognize the exact moment when criminals sealed their own fate. Detective Ethan Holloway and his crew had just crossed that line, and they were too consumed with their racist assumptions to realize they'd walked directly into the trap she'd been setting for months. The afternoon sun continued streaming through her tall windows, illuminating a scene that would soon become evidence in the federal civil rights case that would end Detective Ethan Holloway's career. Every illegal search, every racist comment, every violation of her constitutional rights was being mentally documented by someone who knew exactly how to use it in court. They thought they were raiding a drug dealer's mansion, but they'd actually just provided the final evidence needed to dismantle their entire corrupt operation. As Detective Ethan Holloway moved toward the kitchen to see what Officer Raymond Tate had discovered, Agent Natalie Cross allowed herself one moment of satisfaction. Justice was about to be served, and they delivered it to her front door wrapped in their own criminal stupidity. The afternoon sun streamed through Agent Natalie Cross's floor-to-ceiling windows, casting harsh shadows across her destroyed living room as Detective Ethan Holloway positioned himself directly in front of her. His long-sleeved police uniform was already wrinkled from the forced entry, sweat stains beginning to show under his arms despite the cool air conditioning. He pulled out a small notepad, his pen clicking repeatedly as he stared at her with undisguised suspicion. "Let's start with the basics," Detective Ethan Holloway said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to intimidating civilians. "What's your real name? And how exactly does someone like you afford a place like this?" Agent Natalie Cross sat perfectly straight in her leather armchair, her red blazer slightly askew from being roughly handled during the initial search. Her dark slacks remained pristine despite the chaos surrounding her, and she folded her hands calmly in her lap. The bright overhead fluorescent lights illuminated every detail of her composed expression as she met his gaze without flinching. "My name is Natalie Cross, and I work for the federal government," she replied evenly, her voice carrying no trace of the anger building inside her chest. Detective Ethan Holloway let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head as he scribbled something in his notepad. "Federal government. Right. Let me guess. You're going to tell me you're some kind of accountant or secretary, making enough money to live in $1 million mansion." Officer Raymond Tate's voice echoed from the adjacent dining room, where he was methodically going through her china cabinet. "Detective, you need to see this," he called out, his short-sleeved uniform stretched tight across his stocky frame as he held up an original painting. "This artwork alone is worth more than my annual salary." Detective Ethan Holloway's eyes lit up with predatory satisfaction as he turned back to Agent Natalie Cross. "Expensive art, designer furniture, luxury cars in the garage. This is starting to paint a very clear picture of your real line of work." "And what picture would that be, Detective?" Agent Natalie Cross asked quietly, though she already knew exactly where his assumptions were leading. "Drug dealing, money laundering, maybe both." Detective Ethan Holloway leaned closer, his breath carrying the stale scent of coffee and cigarettes. "See, in my 15 years on the force, I've learned to recognize the signs. Young black woman, living way beyond any legitimate means, expensive taste, cash-heavy lifestyle." Agent Natalie Cross felt her pulse quicken not from fear, but from the controlled rage building in her chest. She made a mental note of his exact words, the timestamp, the witnesses present. Every syllable would be documented in her eventual report. "Detective Holloway," she said, her voice remaining steady despite the insult, "I can provide you with my employment documentation, tax records, and any other proof of legitimate income you require." "Sure you can," Detective Ethan Holloway sneered. "I bet you've got a whole filing cabinet full of fake documents. That's how these operations work." Officer Raymond Tate emerged from the dining room carrying a jewelry box, his black uniform pants slightly dusty from crawling under furniture. "Look at this, Detective. Diamonds, gold, expensive watches. Has to be $50,000 worth of jewelry in here." Detective Ethan Holloway whistled low, examining the contents with greedy eyes. "This keeps getting better. Nobody accumulates this kind of wealth working a legitimate government job, especially not someone your age." Agent Natalie Cross watched as they handled her grandmother's heirloom jewelry with careless hands, pieces that had been in her family for generations now being treated as evidence of criminal activity. The fluorescent lights overhead cast stark shadows across the scene, highlighting the violation of her personal space. "Detective, you're making several assumptions based solely on my race and gender," she said calmly, her legal training keeping her voice controlled. "That constitutes profiling under federal civil rights law." Detective Ethan Holloway's face darkened, his jaw clenching as he stepped closer to her chair. "Don't try to lecture me about the law, sweetheart. I know exactly what I'm doing here, and what I'm doing is investigating obvious criminal activity." "Based on what evidence?" Agent Natalie Cross asked, tilting her head slightly. "You obtained a search warrant based on an anonymous tip, but you haven't found any drugs, weapons, or actual contraband. You're now destroying my property based purely on speculation." The detective's eyes narrowed dangerously. "We'll find what we're looking for. People like you always leave evidence somewhere." "People like me," Agent Natalie Cross repeated slowly, making sure Officer Raymond Tate could hear her from across the room. "Could you clarify what you mean by that phrase, Detective?" Officer Raymond Tate had moved into her home office, where the sound of drawers being yanked open and papers scattered across the floor echoed through the house. "Detective, she's got files everywhere in here. Government documents, legal papers. Looks like she might be running some kind of consulting scam." Detective Ethan Holloway's radio crackled to life, and he grabbed it eagerly. "This is Holloway. I need additional backup units at 1247 Riverside Drive. We've got a major situation developing here." Agent Natalie Cross raised an eyebrow as she listened to him request 3 more patrol cars. The bright afternoon light streaming through her windows illuminated the chaos these officers had created in less than 30 minutes, but she remained perfectly still in her chair. "Detective, under what legal authority are you calling for additional officers?" she asked quietly. "Your warrant specifies a search for illegal substances based on an anonymous tip. You haven't found any contraband to justify expanded operations." Detective Ethan Holloway spun around to face her, his face flushed with anger and frustration. "You seem to know an awful lot about police procedure for someone who claims to be an innocent federal employee. Any citizen should understand their constitutional rights," Agent Natalie Cross replied smoothly. "Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure. Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination. 14th Amendment equal protection clauses." Officer Raymond Tate appeared in the doorway, holding a stack of official-looking documents. "Detective, some of these papers have federal seals on them. They look legitimate." "Fake documents," Detective Ethan Holloway dismissed immediately, probably part of her cover story. "These criminal operations get more sophisticated every year." Agent Natalie Cross watched as Officer Raymond Tate rifled through her work files, documents containing sensitive federal investigations now scattered across her Persian rug. Each violation was being carefully cataloged in her memory for the inevitable lawsuit that would follow. Across the street, Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto stood at her window in her blue jacket and gray slacks, watching the additional police cars arrive with growing alarm. The elderly woman's weathered hands gripped her curtains as she began to realize the magnitude of what her anonymous phone call had set in motion. Detective Agent Natalie Cross said quietly, "You should know that every action you take here is being recorded by my security system." Detective Ethan Holloway froze, his head snapping up to scan the room for cameras. "What security system?" "Standard home protection," she replied calmly. "Motion sensors, audio recording, continuous video monitoring, all stored on cloud servers with automatic backup." Officer Raymond Tate dropped the files he was holding, papers scattering across the hardwood floor. "She's been recording us this whole time." "That's perfectly legal," Agent Natalie Cross said, her voice carrying just a hint of satisfaction. "Private citizens have the right to record police activity on their own property. I believe that was established in several federal court cases, most notably Smith versus Baltimore County." Detective Ethan Holloway's face had gone pale, but he tried to maintain his aggressive stance. "I don't care what you're recording. We're conducting a legitimate investigation based on credible evidence." "Anonymous tips rarely qualify as credible evidence," Agent Natalie Cross replied, "especially when the subsequent search yields no supporting findings. You might want to review your departmental policies on evidence standards." The sound of additional sirens filled the air as 3 more patrol cars pulled into her circular driveway, their red and blue lights casting colorful patterns across her marble foyer through the open front door. Detective Ethan Holloway keyed his radio again. "All units, we're dealing with a sophisticated operation here. Subject appears to have extensive knowledge of police procedure and legal statutes. Proceed with extreme caution." Agent Natalie Cross almost smiled at his description. If he only knew how extensively she understood police procedure, this entire situation would have played out very differently. Officer Raymond Tate had moved to her kitchen, where the bright fluorescent lights revealed her expensive appliances and granite countertops. The sound of cabinet doors slamming open and dishes crashing to the floor indicated his search was becoming increasingly desperate and destructive. "Detective Holloway," Agent Natalie Cross called out, her voice carrying clearly through the house. "You might want to consider the potential liability your department is accruing with each minute this illegal search continues." "Illegal search?" Detective Ethan Holloway laughed harshly. "We have a valid warrant signed by a judge." "A warrant obtained under false pretenses becomes invalid when the supporting evidence proves fabricated or insufficient," she replied calmly. "Basic constitutional law covered in any first-year legal course." Detective Ethan Holloway stared at her for a long moment, his confidence beginning to waver slightly. Something about her complete composure, her detailed knowledge of legal procedure, her calm certainty in the face of his intimidation tactics, was starting to unnerve him. Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto finally stepped away from her window, her blue jacket buttoned tightly against the guilt growing in her chest. She had made that anonymous call because the late-night visitors to Agent Natalie Cross's house had seemed suspicious. But watching this destruction unfold, she was beginning to question her assumptions. The afternoon sun continued streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows as Agent Natalie Cross sat perfectly still in her chair, mentally documenting every civil rights violation, every illegal search tactic, every racist assumption voiced by Detective Ethan Holloway and his team. Soon, she knew, they would discover exactly who they had decided to target. The bright afternoon sunlight streamed through Agent Natalie Cross's floor-to-ceiling windows, casting sharp geometric patterns across her marble foyer. As Detective Ethan Holloway continued his aggressive interrogation, the natural light illuminated every detail of the destruction around them, from overturned furniture to scattered papers, creating an almost theatrical spotlight on the unfolding drama. Agent Natalie Cross stood perfectly still in the center of her living room, her red blazer now torn at the sleeve from Detective Ethan Holloway's rough handling. but her composure remained unshakable. "I've told you repeatedly that I work for the federal government," Agent Natalie Cross said, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to grow stronger with each violation they committed. "Perhaps it's time I showed you exactly what that means." Detective Ethan Holloway scoffed, his long-sleeved uniform wrinkled and stained with sweat from ransacking her home. "Lady, I don't care if you claim to work for the president himself. Nobody in this neighborhood makes their money legally, especially not someone like you." The racist assumption hung in the air like a toxic cloud. But Agent Natalie Cross simply reached into her inner jacket pocket with deliberate precision. Her fingers closed around the leather badge holder she'd been carrying throughout this entire ordeal, waiting for exactly the right moment to reveal her true identity. The timing had to be perfect to create maximum impact and ensure every violation was documented before she ended their illegal operation. "Officer Raymond Tate," she called out calmly to the man searching through her expensive artwork in the adjacent room. "You might want to witness this moment. It's going to be significant for your career." Officer Raymond Tate looked up from the Ming vase he was examining, confused by her confident tone. Something in her voice made him pause. The crystal-clear authority cutting through the chaos of their unauthorized search. He'd been growing increasingly uncomfortable with Detective Ethan Holloway's aggressive tactics and racial profiling, but loyalty had kept him silent. Agent Natalie Cross slowly withdrew her badge, the federal credentials catching the bright sunlight streaming through her windows. The gold shield gleamed as she opened the leather holder, revealing not just any government identification, but the distinctive eagle and scales of justice that marked her as FBI. The words Federal Bureau of Investigation were embossed in bold letters above her photograph, and directly beneath it, the specialized division that would make Detective Ethan Holloway's blood run cold. Agent Natalie Cross, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Civil Rights Division, she announced with quiet authority, holding the badge at eye level where Detective Ethan Holloway couldn't possibly miss it. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Detective Ethan Holloway's face drained of all color, his aggressive posture crumbling as he stared at the credentials that spelled the end of his career. His mouth opened and closed wordlessly, like a fish gasping for air, as the full implications of what he'd done crashed over him. Officer Raymond Tate's hands went numb with shock, and the priceless Ming vase slipped from his grasp, shattering against the marble floor with a crash that echoed through the mansion like a gunshot. The sound seemed to freeze time itself. 4 other officers positioned throughout the house stopped their destructive search, weapons still drawn but forgotten in their hands, as word of Agent Natalie Cross's identity rippled through their ranks. The bright overhead lighting suddenly felt harsh and exposing, illuminating their horrified faces as they realized they'd been caught in the most catastrophic mistake of their law enforcement careers. "FBI Civil Rights Division," Detective Ethan Holloway whispered, reading the badge again as if hoping the words would somehow change. "That's not possible. You're lying. This has to be fake." Agent Natalie Cross smiled for the first time since they'd broken down her door, an expression of controlled satisfaction that didn't reach her eyes. "I've been investigating your department for 8 months, Detective Ethan Holloway. Your unit specifically. Every illegal search, every civil rights violation, every instance of racial profiling has been documented and filed with federal prosecutors." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Detective Ethan Holloway stumbled backward, his hand instinctively reaching for his radio to call for backup. But Agent Natalie Cross's next words stopped him cold. "I moved to this neighborhood because it fit the exact profile of areas you target," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Upscale communities with successful Black residents. I knew if I lived here long enough, you'd eventually come for me. I just didn't expect you'd be stupid enough to break down my door in broad daylight." Officer Raymond Tate sank into one of her leather chairs, his face pale as he realized the magnitude of their mistake. Detective Ethan Holloway, we need to call this in. We need to call Captain Carolyn Bishop right now. You think I haven't already documented every violation? Agent Natalie Cross asked, gesturing toward the small cameras hidden throughout her home. Breaking and entering, destruction of property, illegal search and seizure, civil rights violations. And that's just in the past 30 minutes. I have recordings of everything. Detective Ethan Holloway's radio crackled to life, but his hands shook too violently to operate it properly. He'd built his career on intimidating people he assumed couldn't fight back, but now he faced a federal agent who had systematically set up his downfall. The bright sunlight streaming through the windows felt like a spotlight exposing every dirty secret he'd accumulated over years of corrupt policing. This is impossible, he muttered, desperately trying to find an escape from the trap he'd walked into. We had an anonymous tip. We followed proper procedure. We had reasonable cause to search this property. Agent Natalie Cross laughed, a sound devoid of humor that made several officers flinch. Proper procedure? You broke down my door without a warrant. You assaulted a federal agent. You destroyed personal property based on nothing more than racial assumptions. Detective Ethan Holloway, you've just handed me the final piece of evidence I needed to destroy your entire unit. The sound of squealing tires outside announced the arrival of backup, but not the kind Detective Ethan Holloway had hoped for. Through the large windows, they could see Captain Carolyn Bishop's patrol car racing up the circular driveway, her emergency lights flashing in the bright afternoon sun. Her short-sleeved uniform was wrinkled and disheveled, evidence that she'd rushed from whatever she was doing to respond to Detective Ethan Holloway's panicked radio call. Agent Natalie Cross walked calmly to her front door, stepping over broken glass and scattered belongings with dignity intact. Despite her torn blazer, she opened the door before Captain Carolyn Bishop could knock, greeting her with the professional courtesy of one law enforcement officer to another. Captain Bishop, I presume, Agent Natalie Cross said, displaying her federal credentials. Agent Natalie Cross, FBI Civil Rights Division. Your officers have just committed multiple federal crimes in my home. Captain Carolyn Bishop's face went white as she read the badge, understanding immediately that her department was facing a catastrophic scandal. Her short-sleeved uniform was soaked with sweat from her rushed arrival, and her hands trembled slightly as she took in the destruction visible through the doorway. Agent Cross, I can explain, Captain Carolyn Bishop began, but Agent Natalie Cross cut her off with a raised hand. No explanations necessary, Captain. Everything has been recorded. Your officers will remain here for questioning by federal investigators. Nobody leaves this property until FBI Internal Affairs arrives to process this crime scene. The power dynamic in the room shifted completely in that moment. Detective Ethan Holloway, who had been the aggressor for the past hour, now stood like a condemned man awaiting execution. Officer Raymond Tate stared at the broken vase at his feet, knowing it represented far more than damaged property. The other officers remained frozen throughout the house, weapons lowered, careers effectively over. Agent Natalie Cross moved through her destroyed home with measured steps, documenting each violation with her phone camera while maintaining the authoritative presence that now dominated the space. The bright natural lighting made every detail crystal clear, ensuring her evidence would be undeniable in federal court. You targeted me because I'm a successful black woman living in an expensive neighborhood, she stated matter-of-factly, her camera capturing Detective Ethan Holloway's guilty expression. You assumed I must be involved in criminal activity because in your racist worldview, that's the only way someone like me could afford a home like this. Detective Ethan Holloway opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. Every assumption he'd made, every racist comment he'd uttered, every illegal action he'd taken was now evidence in a federal civil rights case that would end his career and likely send him to prison. Outside, Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto stood at her window across the street, her elderly frame draped in the blue jacket she always wore. watching the scene unfold with growing horror. The anonymous call she'd made about suspicious late-night visitors now seemed like the worst decision of her life, as she realized she'd helped orchestrate the destruction of an innocent woman's home. Agent Natalie Cross noticed her neighbor's distressed figure and felt a moment of sympathy despite everything. Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto had been manipulated by her own unconscious biases, making her another victim of the systemic racism that Agent Natalie Cross had dedicated her career to fighting. The afternoon sun continued streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting everything in sharp relief as Agent Natalie Cross took control of the situation she'd been preparing for throughout her months-long investigation. Detective Ethan Holloway's illegal raid had just become the cornerstone of a federal case that would reshape the entire police department. Captain Bishop, Agent Natalie Cross said, her torn red blazer somehow adding to rather than detracting from her authority. I suggest you contact your superiors immediately. This incident is going to require damage control far beyond your pay grade. The sound of approaching sirens in the distance announced the arrival of federal backup, signaling the beginning of the end for Detective Ethan Holloway and his corrupt unit. Agent Natalie Cross had successfully transformed from victim to victor, using their own illegal actions to spring the trap she'd been setting for months. The destroyed living room looked like a war zone under the bright overhead lights streaming through Agent Natalie Cross's floor-to-ceiling windows. Overturned furniture, scattered papers, and broken glass created a landscape of chaos that Captain Carolyn Bishop surveyed with barely concealed panic. The middle-aged supervisor stood rigid in her crisp short-sleeved uniform and dark pants, her face pale as she processed the magnitude of what had just unfolded. Agent Natalie Cross moved methodically through the wreckage, her red blazer now torn at the shoulder, documenting every piece of damage with her phone camera. The soft click of the camera shutter punctuated the tense silence as she captured overturned bookcases, shattered picture frames, and furniture that had been carelessly thrown aside. Her movements were precise, professional, each photograph a nail in the coffin of Detective Ethan Holloway's career. Agent Cross, I'm sure we can work something out here, Captain Bishop began, her voice strained with desperation. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. My officers were following proper procedure based on credible intelligence. Agent Natalie Cross didn't look up from photographing a demolished coffee table. Proper procedure doesn't include racial profiling, Captain Bishop. It doesn't include destroying private property without a warrant. And it certainly doesn't include the language your Detective Holloway used when questioning how I could afford this home. Detective Ethan Holloway sat slumped in a corner chair, his long-sleeved uniform wrinkled and stained with sweat. The realization that he'd been under federal surveillance for months was written across his face in stark terror. Every illegal search, every civil rights violation, every racist assumption had been documented by the woman whose home he'd just destroyed. You've been watching us, he said quietly, the words barely audible above the ambient noise of federal agents beginning to process the scene. Agent Natalie Cross finally looked at him directly, her dark eyes cold with controlled fury. For 8 months, Detective Holloway, every pattern you and your unit followed, every wealthy black neighborhood you targeted, every assumption you made about who deserved to live where. Did you really think the FBI wouldn't notice when successful African-American families kept filing complaints about harassment from your specific unit? Officer Raymond Tate shifted uncomfortably near the demolished entertainment center, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. The young officer's hands shook as he realized the scope of what they'd walked into. Captain, we received an anonymous tip. Someone called in suspicious activity at this address. Agent Natalie Cross captured another angle of the destroyed room before addressing him. Officer Tate, I know exactly who called in that tip. Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto, my elderly neighbor across the street. She's been watching my house for weeks, concerned about the late-night visitors I've been receiving. Those visitors were my FBI colleagues, coming to brief me on your unit's activities. The same colleagues who will now testify about everything that happened here today. The color drained from Captain Bishop's face as she processed the implications. Agent Cross, surely we can resolve this internally. The department has procedures for addressing concerns about officer conduct. Internal procedures? Agent Natalie Cross's voice carried a sharp edge that cut through the room's tension. Captain, your internal procedures are exactly what I've been investigating. The way complaints against Detective Holloway's unit mysteriously disappear, the way witness statements get lost, the way affluent black residents who file grievances suddenly find themselves subjected to additional scrutiny. She moved to the kitchen area, where bright fluorescent lights illuminated the chaos the officers had created there as well. Cabinets hung open, their contents scattered across marble countertops. Broken dishes crunched under her feet as she documented the destruction. Detective Ethan Holloway finally found his voice, though it came out as a desperate plea. We were acting on intelligence. We had reason to believe illegal activities were taking place at this residence. What reason? Agent Natalie Cross turned to face him fully, her phone still recording. The reason that a black woman lives in $1 million home? The reason that I drive a luxury vehicle? The reason that I have visitors at night who happen to be federal agents briefing me on your unit's pattern of civil rights violations? The sound of vehicles arriving outside drew everyone's attention. Through the large windows, they could see black SUVs parking in the circular driveway. Agent Natalie Cross allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction as she watched her backup arrive. That would be my colleague, Agent Stephanie Voss, and the federal response team, she announced calmly. They've been monitoring this operation from the beginning. Captain Bishop frantically reached for her radio, but Agent Natalie Cross held up a hand. Captain, I'd be very careful about any communications you make right now. Everything you say and do from this point forward will be scrutinized as part of a federal investigation. Agent Stephanie Voss entered through the front door, her orange blouse and black suit pants a sharp contrast to the chaos surrounding them. Behind her, a team of federal agents in tactical gear began securing the scene. The muscular agents moved with practiced efficiency, their presence immediately shifting the power dynamic in the room. Agent Cross, are you injured? Agent Voss's first concern was for her colleagues' welfare, though her keen eyes were already assessing the destruction and the local officer's obvious distress. I'm unharmed, Agent Voss, though as you can see, my home has been thoroughly searched without a warrant and destroyed in the process. Agent Natalie Cross gestured to the chaos around them. Detective Holloway and his unit have provided us with excellent evidence of the civil rights violations we've been documenting. Agent Voss nodded grimly and began directing the federal team. Officers, you'll need to be separated for individual questioning. This is now a federal crime scene, and everything that occurred here is evidence in an ongoing civil rights investigation. Detective Ethan Holloway and Officer Raymond Tate were escorted to different areas of the house, their faces reflecting the growing realization that their careers in law enforcement were over. The bright kitchen fluorescent lights created harsh shadows as federal agents began the methodical process of interviewing each officer individually. Captain Bishop made one last desperate attempt at damage control. Agent Cross, Detective Holloway is a good officer with commendations for his service. Surely his record speaks to his character. Agent Natalie Cross pulled out a tablet from her damaged briefcase, the screen showing months of surveillance data. His record is exactly what I've been investigating, Captain. Detective Holloway has targeted 17 different black families in upscale neighborhoods over the past year alone. Each time, he's found reasons to conduct searches that yielded nothing illegal but resulted in property damage and trauma for the families involved. She scrolled through the data, each entry a carefully documented case of harassment and civil rights violations. The Patterson family in Riverside Heights searched after a neighbor complained about their teenage son's friends visiting. Nothing found. The Williams family in Oak Grove, subjected to a vehicle inspection that damaged their luxury car after Detective Holloway questioned whether it was stolen. Nothing found. The Johnson family in Preston Hills, whose home was searched after Detective Holloway decided their jewelry collection seemed suspicious for their demographic. Captain Bishop's desperation was palpable as she tried to interrupt. Those were legitimate investigations based on credible tips that consistently targeted successful black families. Agent Natalie Cross's voice carried the weight of months of meticulous investigation. Tips that never resulted in arrests, but always resulted in harassment. Tips that followed a clear pattern of racial profiling that your department chose to ignore. Agent Voss approached with preliminary reports from the individual interviews. Agent Cross, Officer Tate is already providing details about how these operations were conducted. It appears Detective Holloway specifically targeted neighborhoods with high concentrations of affluent African American residents. The afternoon sun streaming through the damaged living room windows seemed to spotlight the evidence of the illegal search. Every overturned piece of furniture, every broken item, every violation of Agent Natalie Cross's civil rights had been captured on camera and would soon be presented to federal prosecutors. Detective Ethan Holloway's voice carried from the kitchen where he was being questioned, his protests growing more desperate as federal agents methodically dismantled his justifications. The sound of his career imploding echoed through the house he had illegally invaded. "Captain Bishop," Agent Natalie Cross said finally, her voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement, "this raid will serve as the cornerstone evidence in my civil rights case against your department. Every illegal action taken here today, every constitutional violation, every moment of harassment and destruction has been documented and will be presented to a federal grand jury." Captain Bishop's shoulders sagged as the full scope of the disaster became clear. Her attempts at damage control had failed completely, and she now faced the reality that her entire precinct was about to be placed under federal investigation. Agent Natalie Cross continued documenting the destruction, each photograph serving as evidence of the systematic civil rights violations she had been investigating. The bright lights illuminating the chaos seemed fitting, exposing the dark practices that had hidden behind badges and uniforms for too long. As federal agents continued their methodical processing of the crime scene, Agent Natalie Cross felt a deep satisfaction settling over her. The months of careful investigation, the strategic decision to move into this neighborhood as bait, the patience required to gather sufficient evidence had all led to this moment. The destruction of her home was devastating, but it was also the final piece of evidence needed to bring down Detective Ethan Holloway and reform a system that had allowed civil rights violations to flourish unchecked. The afternoon sun streamed through the large windows of Agent Natalie Cross's home office, casting bright light across the chaos that had been her meticulously organized workspace. File folders lay scattered across the hardwood floor, their contents spilled like confetti around overturned furniture. Her red blazer, now wrinkled and torn at the sleeve from Detective Ethan Holloway's rough handling, caught the natural light as she moved purposefully through the destruction. Captain Carolyn Bishop stood frozen in the doorway, her short-sleeved uniform pristine compared to the disheveled state of her subordinates. The middle-aged supervisor's face had gone pale as Agent Natalie Cross began gathering specific files from the mess, each document she retrieved seeming to drain more color from the captain's complexion. "You want to see what your boys have been up to?" Agent Natalie Cross's voice carried a professional calm that was more terrifying than any shout could have been. She straightened a manila folder, its tab reading Holloway Unit, -a pattern ziculations, in neat block letters. "I've been documenting civil rights violations by Detective Ethan Holloway's unit for the past 8 months. Captain Carolyn Bishop's hands trembled slightly as Agent Natalie Cross opened the first file. Photographs spilled out, showing damaged homes, traumatized families, and evidence of illegal searches. Each image was meticulously labeled with dates, times, and case numbers. The Johnson family on Maple Street. Agent Natalie Cross began, pointing to a photo of a destroyed living room, remarkably similar to her own current situation. Detective Ethan Holloway claimed they were dealing drugs from their home. No drugs found, but $30,000 in damage done during the search. The warrant was obtained using false information. Detective Ethan Holloway appeared in the doorway, his long-sleeved uniform now dark with sweat stains, his face a mask of growing horror as he recognized the photographs. His confident swagger from earlier had evaporated completely, replaced by the hunched posture of a man watching his world collapse. The Martinez family on Oak Avenue. Agent Natalie Cross continued, flipping to another set of photos. Again, Detective Ethan Holloway's unit, another anonymous tip about drug dealing, another prosperous black family, another house destroyed, another empty search. Meanwhile, in the kitchen under the harsh fluorescent lighting, Agent Stephanie Voss had Officer Raymond Tate seated at Agent Natalie Cross's granite breakfast bar. The FBI agent's orange blouse and black suit pants presented a stark professional contrast to Officer Raymond Tate's disheveled appearance. His uniform was wrinkled, his face flushed, and his hands shook as he reached for the water glass Agent Stephanie Voss had provided. "Let's start simple," Agent Stephanie Voss said, her voice gentle but firm as she activated a digital recorder. "How many homes has your unit searched in the past year based on anonymous tips?" Officer Raymond Tate's loyalty was crumbling under the bright lights and the weight of federal scrutiny. I don't know the exact number. Maybe 15, 20? And how many of those homes belong to black families?" The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Officer Raymond Tate stared at the marble countertop, as if it might provide answers that wouldn't destroy his career. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he answered, "All of them." Back in the office, Agent Natalie Cross had spread a map across her desk, the afternoon sun illuminating red pins marking locations throughout the city. Each pin represented a family that had endured what she was experiencing now. "I moved to this neighborhood specifically," Agent Natalie Cross explained to Captain Carolyn Bishop, whose face had now progressed from pale to slightly green. "My profile fit perfectly. Successful black woman, expensive home, visible wealth. I knew Detective Ethan Holloway's unit would target me eventually." Detective Ethan Holloway stepped fully into the room, his voice cracking as he spoke. "You can't prove we targeted anyone based on race. We follow tips, we investigate. That's police work." Agent Natalie Cross turned to face him directly, and for the first time since the raid began, she smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Can't prove it. Detective, I've been recording everything for months. Phone calls, conversations, planning sessions, every racist joke your unit has made about the families you've terrorized, every illegal shortcut you've taken to obtain warrants, every civil rights violation you've committed." The weight of her words hit Detective Ethan Holloway like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, reaching for the doorframe to steady himself. "That's impossible. We sweep for recording devices. We follow procedure." "You sweep for devices in police facilities," Agent Natalie Cross replied, her professional satisfaction evident in her tone. "You don't sweep the coffee shop across from your precinct where I've been sitting with a directional microphone for 2 months. You don't sweep the parking garage where Officer Raymond Tate likes to brag about putting uppity families in their place." In the kitchen, Officer Raymond Tate was experiencing his own moment of truth. The fluorescent lights seemed to grow brighter as Agent Stephanie Voss presented him with photographs of his own actions. "This is you, isn't it?" Agent Stephanie Voss pointed to a surveillance photo showing Officer Raymond Tate throwing a family's possessions into the street during a search. The Williams family. They filed a complaint that was mysteriously lost in the system. Officer Raymond Tate's composure finally shattered completely. Tears began streaming down his face as the full scope of his situation became clear. "We were just following orders. Detective Ethan Holloway said these people were probably criminals anyway. He said they had to be dealing drugs or something worse to afford those houses. So you assumed guilt based on race and economic status?" Yes. God help me, yes. A soft knock at the front door interrupted the revelations unfolding throughout the house. Agent Natalie Cross moved toward the sound, leaving Captain Carolyn Bishop staring at the evidence of her department's systematic civil rights violations. Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto stood on the front porch in her blue jacket and gray slacks, her elderly face streaked with tears. The afternoon sun highlighted every line of guilt and regret etched in her features. "I'm so sorry," the older woman began before Agent Natalie Cross could speak. "I made the call. I saw people coming and going at strange hours, and I assumed." Her voice broke completely. Agent Natalie Cross studied her neighbor's face, seeing genuine remorse and shame. "What did you assume, Mrs. Yamamoto?" "I assumed a young black woman couldn't legitimately afford a home like this. I thought the late-night visitors must be criminal activity. I was wrong, and I'm ashamed." Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto's honesty was painful to witness. "The late-night visitors were my FBI colleagues," Agent Natalie Cross explained gently. "We were planning this investigation. Your call simply gave Detective Ethan Holloway the excuse he was looking for to target another successful black family." As they spoke, a black SUV pulled into the driveway. Agent Philip Garner emerged, his muscular frame impressive, in a green tactical shirt and black pants. The FBI Internal Affairs Specialist carried a large case of crime scene processing equipment. "Agent Cross," he called out as he approached the porch. "Agent Stephanie Voss briefed me on the situation. We need to process everything as evidence for the federal case." Agent Natalie Cross nodded, then turned back to Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto. "Your call was wrong, but it was also the final piece of evidence I needed. Detective Ethan Holloway's unit has been targeting families like mine for months. Today, they walked into a trap." Inside the house, Agent Philip Garner began methodically photographing and cataloging every piece of damage. His muscular arms moved efficiently as he documented overturned furniture, broken ceramics, and scattered personal belongings. Each photograph would become evidence in the federal civil rights case. Captain Carolyn Bishop found herself trapped in the office with Detective Ethan Holloway, both of them staring at the mountain of evidence Agent Natalie Cross had compiled. Maps, photographs, audio transcripts, and surveillance reports painted a picture of systematic racial profiling and civil rights violations that spanned months. "Every case you've worked in the past year is now compromised," Agent Natalie Cross informed Detective Ethan Holloway as she returned to the office. "Every arrest, every search, every warrant, federal prosecutors will review them all for civil rights violations." Detective Ethan Holloway's legs gave out, and he collapsed into Agent Natalie Cross's desk chair. The arrogant officer who had broken down her door just hours earlier was gone, replaced by a broken man facing the destruction of everything he'd built. "You don't understand," he pleaded. "These neighborhoods, these people living beyond their means, it's suspicious. We were doing our jobs." "Your job is to enforce the law equally," Agent Natalie Cross replied. "Not to assume that successful black Americans must be criminals, not to terrorize families based on racial stereotypes, not to violate constitutional rights because you can't believe a black woman might legitimately afford a nice home." In the kitchen, Officer Raymond Tate was providing Agent Stephanie Voss with details that painted an even darker picture of their unit's activities. The fluorescent lights seemed to grow harsher with each confession. Detective Ethan Holloway called them charity cases, Officer Raymond Tate admitted. He said the government probably gave them money they didn't deserve, or they were dealing drugs, or stealing. He said it was our job to prove it. "And when you never found evidence of crimes," he said, "we just hadn't looked hard enough. That's why we got so destructive during searches." He said criminals hide evidence better than honest people. Agent Stephanie Voss made careful notes, each admission building the federal case stronger. How many officers in your unit shared these beliefs? Most of us. Maybe all of us. Officer Raymond Tate's honesty was destroying his colleagues, but he seemed unable to stop. The weight of months of illegal activity was pouring out of him. Agent Philip Garner had moved through the house systematically, documenting damage in every room. His green tactical shirt was now dusty from the debris, but his work was thorough and professional. In Agent Natalie Cross's bedroom, he discovered something that made him call out, "Agent Cross, you need to see this." She found him in her walk-in closet, pointing to a small device mounted behind her hanging clothes. "Hidden camera," he explained, "professional grade. This has been recording everything." Agent Natalie Cross smiled for the second time that day, this expression carrying pure triumph. "I told you I was recording everything, every violation of my civil rights, every illegal action, every moment of this raid is documented." Captain Carolyn Bishop appeared in the closet doorway, her face now completely drained of color. "You recorded the entire raid, from the moment you broke down my door to this conversation right now. Every racist assumption, every illegal search technique, every constitutional violation, it's all evidence." Detective Ethan Holloway stumbled into the closet behind his captain, looking like a man who'd seen his own ghost. "This was all planned. You set us up." "I investigated you," Agent Natalie Cross corrected. "You set yourselves up by choosing to violate people's civil rights, by targeting families based on race, by assuming that black success must equal criminal activity." The afternoon sun was beginning to shift, casting longer shadows through the large windows, but the bright natural light still illuminated every corner of the devastation. Agent Philip Garner continued his methodical documentation, each photograph and measurement another nail in the coffin of Detective Ethan Holloway's career. Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto had remained on the porch, her blue jacket wrapped tightly around her shoulders despite the warm afternoon. When Agent Natalie Cross returned to speak with her, the elderly woman's guilt was still overwhelming. "I want to testify," Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto said suddenly, "about why I made that call, about the assumptions I made. If it helps your case, if it prevents this from happening to other families, I want to help." Agent Natalie Cross studied her neighbor's face, seeing genuine commitment to make amends. "Your testimony about racial bias in the community will be valuable. It shows the broader context of why Detective Ethan Holloway's unit felt comfortable targeting successful black families." Inside, the investigation was reaching its climax. Agent Stephanie Voss had extracted a complete confession from Officer Raymond Tate about the unit's illegal practices. Captain Carolyn Bishop was frantically trying to contact her superiors to begin damage control. Detective Ethan Holloway sat in shocked silence as Agent Philip Garner processed evidence that would destroy not just his career, but potentially land him in federal prison. Agent Natalie Cross stood in her ransacked living room, surrounded by the evidence of both the crime committed against her and the larger crimes she'd been investigating. Her red blazer caught the afternoon light streaming through her floor-to-ceiling windows as she surveyed the scene with professional satisfaction. The trap had been perfect. 8 months of careful planning, meticulous evidence gathering, and strategic positioning had led to this moment. Detective Ethan Holloway's unit had finally crossed the line from civil rights violations to federal crimes, and she had recorded every second of it. As Agent Philip Garner packed the hidden cameras that had captured everything, Agent Natalie Cross felt the deep satisfaction of a mission accomplished. The investigation was complete, the evidence overwhelming, and justice was finally within reach for all the families who had suffered at the hands of Detective Ethan Holloway's corrupt unit. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Agent Natalie Cross's marble foyer as another black sedan pulled into her circular driveway. Through her floor-to-ceiling windows She watched District Attorney Franklin Hobbs step out, his navy suit impeccable despite the urgency that had brought him here. His tie was perfectly knotted, but his face carried the weight of understanding exactly what kind of federal storm was about to engulf the city's police department. Agent Natalie Cross smoothed her red blazer, now changed from the torn one Detective Ethan Holloway had damaged during the illegal raid. Her black slacks were crisp and professional as she moved through her home, stepping carefully around the scattered debris that still littered her once pristine living spaces. Each broken picture frame, each overturned piece of furniture, represented another nail in Detective Ethan Holloway's legal coffin. District Attorney Franklin Hobbs entered through the front door that hung askew on its hinges, a constant reminder of the violent entry that had changed everything. His experienced eyes swept the destruction, and Agent Natalie Cross watched his jaw tighten as he processed the magnitude of civil rights violations laid bare before him. "Agent Cross," he said, extending his hand with the respect that Detective Ethan Holloway had refused to show. "I came as soon as I received the call from Agent Voss. This is a federal matter now." Agent Natalie Cross led him into her dining room, where the bright overhead fluorescent lights illuminated boxes of carefully organized evidence she had been preparing for months. The mahogany table, scratched from Officer Raymond Tate's careless search, now served as command central for the case that would reshape the entire police department. "District Attorney Hobbs, what you're about to see represents 8 months of undercover investigation into systematic civil rights violations," Agent Natalie Cross began, her voice steady and professional. She opened the first file folder, revealing photographs of other black homeowners who had suffered similar raids. "Detective Ethan Holloway's unit has been targeting successful African-American residents across 3 neighborhoods, using anonymous tips as pretexts for illegal searches." District Attorney Franklin Hobbs studied the photographs under the bright dining room lights, his expression growing darker with each image. "How many victims are we talking about?" 17 documented cases, Agent Natalie Cross replied, satisfaction evident in her controlled tone. "All successful black professionals living in upscale neighborhoods, all subjected to property destruction, illegal searches, and racist interrogation tactics. All cases where no drugs or contraband were found, yet the officers faced no consequences." The front door opened again, and Officer Raymond Tate entered flanked by 2 FBI agents. His uniform was disheveled, sweat stains visible on his short-sleeved shirt despite the afternoon chill. His dark pants were wrinkled, and his face carried the haunted expression of a man whose world was crumbling around him. Agent Stephanie Voss, still wearing her orange blouse and black suit pants from earlier, approached Agent Natalie Cross with a knowing look. "Officer Tate is ready to cooperate fully. He's agreed to provide testimony in exchange for reduced federal charges." Officer Raymond Tate sat heavily in one of the dining room chairs, the overhead fluorescent lights making his pale complexion appear almost ghostly. "I want to make this right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What we did here, what we've been doing, it's not police work. It's harassment based on race. And I'm tired of pretending otherwise." Agent Natalie Cross leaned forward, her dark eyes fixed on Officer Raymond Tate with laser focus. "Tell District Attorney Hobbs about the quota system. Detective Holloway had us targeting at least 2 suspicious homes per month in upscale areas," Officer Raymond Tate confessed, his hands shaking as he spoke. He said successful black residents were probably dealing drugs or laundering money. He called it evening the playing field. "We were supposed to find something, anything, to justify the raids." District Attorney Franklin Hobbs exchanged glances with Agent Natalie Cross, both understanding the federal implications. How many officers were involved in this systematic targeting? "The whole unit. 12 officers total. Detective Holloway made it clear that questioning the strategy would hurt our careers." Officer Raymond Tate's voice cracked with the weight of his confession. Another vehicle pulled up outside, and through the afternoon sunlight streaming through her windows, Agent Natalie Cross saw Detective Bridget Callahan approaching. Unlike her corrupted colleagues, Detective Callahan wore her short-sleeved uniform with pride, her black pants pressed and professional. Her posture radiated integrity as she walked through the broken doorway. "Agent Cross," Detective Callahan said, removing her cap respectfully. "I'm here to provide testimony supporting your investigation. What Detective Holloway and his unit have been doing contradicts everything we swore to uphold as police officers." Agent Natalie Cross studied Detective Callahan's face under the bright overhead lights, recognizing the courage it took to speak against fellow officers. "How long have you known about the targeting?" "6 months. I tried reporting it through internal channels, but Captain Bishop buried my complaints. She said I was being overly sensitive about community relations. When I persisted, I was transferred to a different shift to keep me away from Detective Holloway's operations." The dining room was beginning to feel like a federal courthouse as evidence and testimony accumulated under the fluorescent lighting. Agent Natalie Cross opened another file folder, this one containing audio recordings and surveillance footage that would serve as the foundation for multiple federal prosecutions. Heavy footsteps in the foyer announced another crucial arrival. Chief Commissioner Monica Strand entered wearing a burgundy blazer and black slacks, her stern expression reflecting the political nightmare engulfing her department. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, but her eyes carried the stress of a leader watching her organization implode under federal scrutiny. "Agent Cross," Chief Commissioner Monica Strand said formally, "I'm here to inform you that Detective Ethan Holloway and his entire unit are being suspended pending federal investigation. I'm also implementing immediate reforms to prevent future incidents." Agent Natalie Cross stood, her red blazer catching the afternoon light as she faced the police chief. "Commissioner Strand, your department has enabled systematic civil rights violations for years. Suspension is just the beginning. These officers will face federal prosecution for conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law." "I understand the severity," Chief Commissioner Monica Strand replied, though her voice carried the defensiveness of someone trying to protect her career. "We're cooperating fully with the federal investigation." District Attorney Franklin Hobbs spread additional documents across the scratched mahogany table, the overhead lights illuminating the legal framework that would destroy Detective Ethan Holloway's life. "Agent Cross, this illegal raid on your home provides the perfect capstone to your investigation. The video evidence, combined with Officer Tate's testimony and Detective Callahan's corroboration, creates an airtight federal case." Agent Natalie Cross moved to her damaged bookshelf, retrieving a hidden camera device that had recorded everything. Every moment of today's raid was captured in high definition. Detective Holloway's racist assumptions, the illegal property destruction, the complete disregard for constitutional rights. This footage will be Exhibit A in multiple federal prosecutions. Officer Raymond Tate buried his face in his hands, the weight of his complicity crushing down on him under the bright fluorescent lights. How many families did we traumatize? How many innocent people had their homes destroyed because Detective Holloway convinced us they didn't deserve what they'd earned? The question hung in the air like a verdict as Agent Stephanie Voss reviewed witness statements from other victims who were already coming forward. Her orange blouse reflected the afternoon sunlight as she worked methodically through testimonies that would support the federal case. A soft knock at the broken door interrupted the legal proceedings. Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto stood tentatively in the doorway, still wearing her blue jacket and gray slacks from earlier. Her elderly face was etched with guilt and remorse as she clutched a written statement in her weathered hands. "Agent Cross, I need to provide my statement about the phone call I made," Mrs. Yamamoto said, her voice trembling with shame. "I realize now that I was influenced by racial bias when I called in suspicious activity. I saw successful black visitors to your home and assumed something illegal must be happening. Agent Natalie Cross approached her elderly neighbor with compassion, understanding that Mrs. Yamamoto was also a victim of the systemic racism that Detective Ethan Holloway had exploited. Mrs. Yamamoto, your honesty about the unconscious bias helps strengthen the case against officers who prey on community prejudices. District Attorney Franklin Hobbs accepted Mrs. Yamamoto's written statement, adding it to the growing pile of evidence under the dining room's bright lights. This testimony demonstrates how Detective Holloway's unit weaponized racial stereotypes to generate probable cause for illegal searches. Detective Bridget Callahan stood near the window where afternoon sun illuminated her honest features. Agent Cross, I want you to know that there are good officers who've been waiting for someone with your authority to expose this corruption. Your sacrifice in enduring this raid will save countless other families from similar trauma. Agent Natalie Cross felt a deep sense of vindication as she surveyed the scene in her dining room. Under the overhead fluorescent lights, surrounded by evidence of systematic injustice, she was methodically building the federal case that would transform Detective Ethan Holloway from predator to prisoner. The beauty of federal civil rights law, she explained to the assembled group, is that it treats conspiracy to violate constitutional rights as seriously as the violations themselves. Detective Holloway didn't just commit crimes today. He orchestrated a systematic campaign of racial terrorism under color of law. Chief Commissioner Monica Strand shifted uncomfortably in her burgundy blazer as the legal implications became clear. What kind of sentences are we looking at for the involved officers? District Attorney Franklin Hobbs consulted his notes under the bright overhead lighting. Federal civil rights violations carry up to 10 years per incident. Conspiracy charges add additional time. Detective Holloway is looking at decades in federal prison. The afternoon sun continued streaming through Agent Natalie Cross's large windows as she contemplated the cascade of consequences that would reshape the entire police department. Her red blazer seemed to glow with righteous purpose as she realized how her personal trauma was becoming the catalyst for systemic change. Gentlemen, ladies, Agent Natalie Cross said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had transformed victimization into victory. By the time this case concludes, Detective Ethan Holloway's illegal raid will be remembered as the moment that ended systematic racial profiling in this city. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about preventing future victims. The consequences were indeed cascading, and Agent Natalie Cross stood at the center of the storm she had carefully orchestrated, watching corrupt officers face the federal justice system they had spent years perverting. The morning sun streamed through Agent Natalie Cross's floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating her completely restored living room. 3 weeks had passed since the illegal raid, and every trace of destruction had been meticulously repaired. The marble floors gleamed under the natural skylight, and new furniture replaced everything Detective Ethan Holloway's crew had destroyed. Agent Natalie Cross stood near her mahogany desk, wearing a fresh red blazer and crisp black slacks, reviewing the final documents that would seal Detective Ethan Holloway's fate. District Attorney Franklin Hobbs adjusted his navy tie as he spread federal charging documents across Agent Natalie Cross's dining table. The fluorescent lights overhead cast sharp shadows on the papers that would destroy multiple careers. Agent Stephanie Voss, in her signature orange blouse and black suit pants, organized evidence files with the precision of someone who had spent months building an airtight case. Agent Cross, your investigation has given us everything we need, District Attorney Franklin Hobbs said, his voice filled with professional admiration. Detective Ethan Holloway faces 14 federal charges, including conspiracy to violate civil rights, illegal search and seizure, destruction of federal property, and intimidation of a federal officer. Agent Natalie Cross felt a surge of satisfaction as she reviewed each charge. Every violation she had quietly documented during the raid was now transformed into a legal weapon. The racist assumptions, the destruction of her property, the illegal search based on nothing but prejudice, All of it would be used to ensure Detective Ethan Holloway never wore a badge again. What about Officer Raymond Tate's cooperation? Agent Natalie Cross asked, settling into her restored leather chair. Agent Stephanie Voss looked up from her files. His testimony has been invaluable. He's revealed a pattern we didn't even know existed. Detective Ethan Holloway's unit specifically targeted successful black homeowners across 3 different neighborhoods over the past 2 years. The scope of the corruption was staggering. Officer Raymond Tate had broken down completely during his federal interview, confessing to 12 separate incidents where Detective Ethan Holloway had manufactured probable cause to search upscale homes owned by black families. The pattern was always the same: anonymous tips about drug activity that mysteriously focused on the most successful black residents in gentrifying neighborhoods. District Attorney Franklin Hobbs spread a map across the table, marking locations with red pins. We've identified at least 15 families who were illegally targeted. Your case was supposed to be their biggest score, but instead it became their downfall. Agent Natalie Cross studied the map, feeling anger and vindication in equal measure. Each pin represented a family that had been violated, their success treated as evidence of criminality simply because of their race. But now their suffering would serve a greater purpose, ensuring systemic change that would protect future families. The sound of vehicles approaching drew their attention to the windows. Chief Commissioner Monica Strand stepped out of her official car, wearing a blue jacket and gray pants, her face grim with the knowledge of what she had to announce. Behind her, news vans were already setting up equipment, their bright media lights preparing to broadcast the downfall of Detective Ethan Holloway's crew. Agent Natalie Cross watched from her window as Chief Commissioner Monica Strand approached the microphones. The commissioner's usually confident demeanor was replaced by the weight of institutional failure. She cleared her throat and began speaking to the assembled reporters. Today, federal charges have been filed against Detective Ethan Holloway, Officer Raymond Tate, and 4 additional members of their unit for systematic civil rights violations, Chief Commissioner Monica Strand announced. These charges stem from an FBI investigation that revealed a pattern of racial profiling and illegal searches targeting black homeowners in our city. The satisfaction Agent Natalie Cross felt was not personal revenge, but professional vindication. Every hour she had spent building this case, every racist comment she had endured during the raid, every moment of violation had led to this announcement. Detective Ethan Holloway's badge was not just being taken away. His actions were being exposed as part of a systematic pattern of corruption. Agent Stephanie Voss joined Agent Natalie Cross at the window. The victim hotline has been overwhelmed since news of the investigation broke. 12 additional families have come forward with similar experiences. Each new victim strengthened the federal case exponentially. What had started as Agent Natalie Cross's individual investigation was transforming into a comprehensive dismantling of institutionalized racism within the department. The illegal raid on her home had become the keystone that brought down an entire corrupt structure. District Attorney Franklin Hobbs received a text message and looked up with satisfaction. Detective Ethan Holloway has been arrested at his home. He's being processed at federal holding right now. Agent Natalie Cross imagined Detective Ethan Holloway experiencing the same violation he had inflicted on innocent families. The man who had broken down her door based on nothing but racial assumptions was now facing the full weight of federal justice. His long-sleeved uniform would be replaced with prison clothing, his badge of authority transformed into evidence of his crimes. The afternoon sun shifted position, filling the room with even brighter natural light as Chief Commissioner Monica Strand concluded her press conference. Agent Natalie Cross noticed Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto across the street, still wearing her blue jacket, watching the media coverage with obvious guilt and concern. Commissioner Strand is announcing the formation of a new oversight board, Agent Stephanie Voss observed, monitoring the press conference through the window. Chief Commissioner Monica Strand's voice carried across the lawn as she detailed sweeping reforms. Effective immediately, all search warrants will require additional review when targeting homeowners in designated neighborhoods. We are implementing mandatory bias training for all officers and establishing a civilian review board with the authority to investigate complaints of racial profiling. These weren't just cosmetic changes designed to appease public criticism. Agent Natalie Cross had worked with federal prosecutors to ensure that meaningful reform was built into the settlement agreement. The department would be monitored by federal oversight for the next 5 years, with specific benchmarks for eliminating discriminatory practices. A knock at the door interrupted their observation. Detective Bridget Callahan stood on the threshold, wearing a crisp, short-sleeved uniform and black pants, her honest face showing both respect and determination. She had been the key witness whose testimony corroborated Agent Natalie Cross's investigation, risking her career to expose corruption within her own department. Agent Cross, I wanted to thank you personally, Detective Bridget Callahan said as she entered the restored living room. What you've accomplished here goes far beyond individual justice. You've given honest officers like me the tools to rebuild our department the right way. Agent Natalie Cross shook Detective Bridget Callahan's hand, recognizing a kindred spirit committed to genuine justice. Commissioner Strand mentioned your promotion. You'll be heading the reformed unit? Yes, ma'am. And I promise you, we'll operate with the integrity Detective Ethan Holloway never understood. Every officer under my command will understand that serving and protecting means everyone in our community, regardless of their race or success. The transformation was already beginning. Detective Bridget Callahan represented the possibility of law enforcement that served rather than targeted, that protected rather than profiled. Her promotion sent a clear message that honesty and integrity would be rewarded while corruption would face swift consequences. Agent Stephanie Voss updated them on the expanding investigation. Officer Raymond Tate's cooperation has revealed financial irregularities as well. Detective Ethan Holloway was selling confiscated property and pocketing the proceeds. The federal charges now include theft and money laundering. Each new revelation added years to Detective Ethan Holloway's potential sentence. What had begun as civil rights violations was expanding into a comprehensive picture of corruption that would ensure he never threatened another innocent family. The man who had questioned how Agent Natalie Cross could afford her home was now facing decades in federal prison. Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto appeared at the door, her elderly frame still wrapped in her familiar blue jacket. Her face showed the weight of guilt over her anonymous call, but also determination to make amends for her mistake. Agent Cross, I hope you can forgive an old woman's ignorance, Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto said softly. I've joined the community group working on bias education. We're hosting meetings to help neighbors recognize their own prejudices before they cause harm. Agent Natalie Cross felt genuine warmth toward her neighbor. Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto's willingness to confront her own biases and work for change represented the community healing that could emerge from this trauma. Her anonymous call had ultimately led to justice, though not in the way she had intended. Mrs. Yamamoto, your courage in coming forward and acknowledging the mistake is exactly what our community needs, Agent Natalie Cross replied. Change happens when good people are willing to examine their assumptions and grow. The community meetings were another victory emerging from the investigation. Agent Natalie Cross had insisted that education and dialogue be part of the settlement agreement. The department would fund bias training not just for officers, but for community members who might make similar assumptions in the future. As the afternoon progressed, Agent Natalie Cross received confirmation that all 6 officers involved in the raid were now facing federal charges. Officer Raymond Tate would receive a reduced sentence for his cooperation, but he would never work in law enforcement again. The others faced sentences ranging from 3 to 15 years, depending on their level of involvement in the systematic corruption. District Attorney Franklin Hobbs gathered his documents as the sun began to set through the skylight. Agent Cross This case will be studied in law schools and police academies for decades. You've created a blueprint for how federal civil rights enforcement can dismantle institutional racism." Agent Natalie Cross looked around her restored living room, remembering the chaos and violation of the illegal raid just weeks earlier. Detective Ethan Holloway had intended to destroy her life based on nothing but racist assumptions. Instead, his actions had provided the evidence needed to destroy an entire network of corruption and create lasting change. The fluorescent lights reflected off her FBI commendation letter, which had arrived that morning, acknowledging her successful undercover investigation. But the real satisfaction came from knowing that no other family would suffer what she had endured. Detective Ethan Holloway's prejudice had become the instrument of his own destruction, while Agent Natalie Cross's strategic patience had transformed personal trauma into systematic justice. As her guests departed, and evening settled over her neighborhood, Agent Natalie Cross stood in her pristine living room, bathed in the last rays of natural light. Tomorrow would bring Detective Ethan Holloway's arraignment, where he would face the consequences of his choices. But tonight, she would rest, knowing that justice had been served, and her community was safer because corrupt officers no longer wore badges they had never deserved. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Agent Natalie Cross's fully restored mansion, casting golden light across the pristine marble floors that had once been littered with the debris of an illegal raid. 6 months had passed since that fateful afternoon when Detective Ethan Holloway and his corrupt crew had shattered more than just her front door. They had shattered the illusion that badges always represented justice. Agent Natalie Cross stood in her living room, wearing a celebratory red dress and black jacket, holding a newspaper that bore the headline she had been waiting for. Former detective sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for civil rights violations. The photograph below showed Detective Ethan Holloway in handcuffs, his once arrogant expression replaced by the hollow stare of a man whose world had crumbled around him. She traced her finger along the article's text, savoring every word that detailed his downfall. 5 years in federal prison, permanent disbarment from law enforcement, civil rights violations, illegal search and seizure, destruction of property. Each charge represented a victory, not just for her, but for every black family who had suffered under his racist assumptions and illegal tactics. The article continued with details about Officer Raymond Tate's sentencing. His cooperation with federal investigators had earned him a reduced sentence of 18 months, but like his former partner, he was permanently barred from police work. The man who had ransacked her belongings while following Detective Ethan Holloway's lead would never again have the authority to enter someone's home under the color of law. Agent Natalie Cross folded the newspaper and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood that had become a symbol of transformation. The same streets where Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto had once watched with suspicious eyes now buzzed with community members preparing for an important meeting about police reform. 2 hours later, the community center blazed with bright fluorescent lighting as dozens of residents filled every seat. Agent Natalie Cross stood at the back of the room, watching as Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto approached the podium. The elderly woman wore her familiar blue jacket over a crisp white blouse and gray slacks, but her demeanor had completely transformed from the fearful neighbor who had made that fateful anonymous call. 6 months ago, I made a terrible mistake, Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto began, her voice carrying clearly through the overhead speakers. I called the police on my neighbor because I let fear and prejudice cloud my judgment. But what happened next showed me what real courage looks like. The room fell silent as Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto continued. Agent Natalie Cross didn't just survive an illegal raid on her home. She turned that violation into a catalyst for change that will protect all of us. Today, I'm proud to introduce a woman who transformed trauma into purpose, Agent Natalie Cross. Applause erupted as Agent Natalie Cross made her way to the podium, her red dress and black jacket standing out under the bright lights. She looked out at the diverse crowd of faces, seeing hope where once there had been division. When Detective Ethan Holloway and his crew broke down my door, they thought they were targeting just another black woman who didn't belong in their vision of this neighborhood. Agent Natalie Cross began. They were wrong on every level, but their mistake became our opportunity to demand something better. She gestured toward a presentation screen that displayed statistics about police reform in their district. The new Police Oversight Board has reviewed over 300 cases in the past 6 months. 12 officers have been suspended for bias-related violations. Mandatory bias training is now required quarterly for all patrol units. The crowd murmured approvatively as Agent Natalie Cross continued. But the real victory isn't just in the numbers. It's in the fact that Mrs. Yamamoto felt comfortable enough to call me directly last week when she had concerns about suspicious activity, rather than immediately calling the police. It's in the community watch groups that have formed to protect each other. It's in the conversations happening in living rooms across this neighborhood about how we can do better. Across town, in the brightly lit conference room of the municipal building, the new Police Oversight Board conducted their weekly meeting under fluorescent lights that illuminated both documents and determination. Chief Commissioner Monica Strand, wearing a professional navy blazer and black slacks, presented the latest reform initiatives to the Board of Community Leaders. Detective Bridget Callahan's reformed unit has completed its 3rd month of enhanced bias training, Chief Commissioner Monica Strand reported. Response times have improved, complaint rates have dropped 60%, and community trust indicators are at their highest level in 5 years. The board members, representing diverse community stakeholders, reviewed body camera footage and incident reports with the kind of scrutiny that Detective Ethan Holloway's unit had once avoided. The bright overhead lights left no shadows for corruption to hide in, no dark corners where civil rights violations could fester unnoticed. Meanwhile, in a federal courthouse downtown, Agent Natalie Cross met with Agent Stephanie Voss in a sun-filled conference room. Agent Stephanie Voss wore an orange blouse and black suit pants, her expression mixing professional pride with personal admiration for her colleague's achievement. "The FBI director wants to personally present your commendation next month," Agent Stephanie Voss said, sliding a folder across the polished conference table. "Your undercover work has become a model for civil rights investigations nationwide." Agent Natalie Cross opened the folder to find letters from families across the country who had been inspired by her story to report their own experiences with police misconduct. Each letter represented another step toward the systemic change she had fought to achieve. "This is more meaningful than any commendation," Agent Natalie Cross said, holding up a letter from a family in Atlanta whose illegal raid case was now being investigated by federal authorities. These families found their voice because they saw that justice was possible. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as Agent Natalie Cross returned home to prepare for the evening's culminating event. She had invited the entire neighborhood to a community barbecue in her backyard, transforming the space that had once been invaded by hostility into a place of healing and unity. As guests began arriving, the golden hour light illuminated faces that reflected the neighborhood's diversity. Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto arrived first, her blue jacket complemented by a bright smile that spoke of genuine friendship rather than fearful surveillance. Behind her came families with children, elderly couples, young professionals, and community leaders, all united by their shared commitment to positive change. Detective Bridget Callahan appeared at the gate, wearing civilian clothes instead of her uniform. Her jeans and green blouse marked her as a neighbor rather than an authority figure, symbolizing the relationship between police and community that Agent Natalie Cross had fought to establish. "I wanted to thank you personally," Detective Bridget Callahan said as Agent Natalie Cross greeted her at the gate. "The training protocols you helped develop have changed everything about how we approach our work. My officers actually look forward to community interactions now, instead of dreading them." As the sun began to set, Agent Natalie Cross stood on her back deck, watching children play in her yard while their parents shared food and conversation. The same backyard that had once been surveilled as evidence of suspicious affluence now hosted the kind of community gathering that made neighborhoods stronger. District Attorney Franklin Hobbs approached, carrying a plate of barbecue and wearing a satisfied expression. "I wanted you to know that 3 other jurisdictions have requested copies of the prosecution model we used in the Holloway case. Your evidence collection methods are being taught in law schools now." The gathering continued as natural light gave way to warm patio lighting, but the atmosphere of hope and renewal remained constant. Agent Natalie Cross moved through the crowd, no longer the isolated target of racist assumptions, but a celebrated catalyst for positive change. Mrs. Harriet Yamamoto found her near the dessert table. Both women reflected in the glow of string lights overhead. "I've been thinking about that day I made the call," the elderly woman said softly. "I realize now that I wasn't really afraid of suspicious activity. I was afraid of change, of difference, of things I didn't understand." Agent Natalie Cross placed a gentle hand on her neighbor's shoulder. "Fear can make us do terrible things, but courage can help us fix them. You found that courage, and that matters more than the mistake." As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Agent Natalie Cross stood in her restored living room, looking at the photographs that would document this celebration. The same space where Detective Ethan Holloway had made his racist assumptions now hosted evidence of a community transformed. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Agent Stephanie Voss. "Just saw the news. Holloway's unit pattern has been identified in 6 other cities. Federal task forces being formed. Your case is the precedent they've all been waiting for." Agent Natalie Cross smiled, understanding that the victory was complete, but the work was ongoing. Detective Ethan Holloway's conviction had ended his ability to violate civil rights, but her example had inspired others to continue the fight for justice. The bright morning light that had illuminated her newspaper reading now seemed prophetic. She had transformed the darkness of that illegal raid into the illumination of systemic change, proving that even the most traumatic violations could become catalysts for justice. In her red dress and black jacket, standing in her fully restored mansion, Agent Natalie Cross represented something powerful. The truth that dignity could not be destroyed by prejudice, that justice could emerge from injustice, and that one person's courage to fight back could light the way for countless others seeking the same vindication and reform. You just heard a story that history tried to overlook. If it stayed with you, take a second to stand with it. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling the stories that deserve light, not silence.